This webinar today is brought to you by Turnkey Solutions. Turnkey is a large long-term partner with HP, and we have today with us their Director of Customer Success. Next slide. I am Robert Linton. I work with Cortex as a VP of our ALM Solutions. We are also a HP partner. Next slide. So today's speaker will be Becky Karsh. Becky has been with Turnkey Solutions for a little while now. Before that, she played many different roles at McKesson, ProStore Systems, SpectraLink, and Storage Tech. Becky brings to our presentation today her 30 years of experience in the quality assurance and test automation market, and where she's worked with many different products across different technical architectures and platforms. Becky has firsthand experiences on what it takes to develop not only a test automation process, but a test automation framework. And as she's doing today, Becky often shares some of her experiences and lessons learned with audiences such as today's Vivid audience. Next. Next slide, please. Just before we get started, a few housekeeping rules, if you will. If you see up in the upper right-hand corner, you'll have the panel that allows you to see what's going on and be able to ask questions. And if you have a question that you want to send, you would have to open up this questions panel. Today's webinar is being recorded. And after the webinar has concluded and we've had time to post it, the webinar will be available on the Vivid website for you to review again and share with others that are also members of Vivid. The panel, if you're not familiar with it, has several different sections. And one of the most important sections for today's webinar is the questions section. If you're looking at the panel right now, the questions area will be condensed or retracted up. To expand it, you have to click on the plus sign that's next to the word question, and then you'll be able to type in your questions, and then at the end of the webinar, we'll try to answer as many of those as we can. If we don't get to all your questions because we run out of time, all the questions will be recorded into a document, and they'll be posted on the Vivid website also after the webinar concludes, a day or two later. Next slide. So at this point, I'm going to turn the webinar over to Becky, and she'll be talking to us today about developing a comprehensive test automation quality assurance strategy. Becky?
Thanks so much, Robert. It's my distinct pleasure to be speaking to you all today and sharing with you a little bit of my 30 years of experience in QA and testing from mostly a management perspective, director perspective, but also my experience having worked with Turnkey's customers from a professional services standpoint. So what we're going to cover today is we're going to talk about assessing your current state of test automation readiness. We're going to talk about optimizing test automation and the people and the processes, benefits of data-driven scriptless test technology, maintaining regression tests, leveraging a mix of tools and technologies in your testing, and then getting some value out of your test automation. But before I do that, I'd like to start with a poll. So Terry, if you don't mind loading the poll, please.
So this poll question is going to ask you about what is your biggest challenge that you as an organization face with your software delivery cycle. You have four choices: either testing processes slowing us down, knowing when to release, difficulty getting the teams organized, or finding the right tools to streamline the process. If you would be so kind as to vote and select one of these answers as your biggest challenge currently faced today, we'll wait a few minutes and let everybody get a chance to respond to the poll question. When the answers are all in, we'll review the answer, and then we'll turn the webinar back over to Becky. Hope everybody's getting a chance to select their answer. We'll wait another couple of minutes, seconds, before we look at the results. We've got over 100 some odd people on this webinar, so it may take them a minute to get all their selections and submitted. Okay, let's take a look and see what the results are. Okay, so the results are in, and it looks like it's pretty much a tie for 40% of the audience today selecting difficulty getting the team organized, and then another 40% are saying that they're having a difficulty finding the right tools to streamline the process, and then 14% are saying the testing process is slowing them down, and 6% selected knowing when to release. So I think this is good information for Becky as she continues with her presentation today. Becky, back to you.
Yeah, thanks, Robert. That'll really help me to focus in on some things, for the viewing audience here. So really what we're looking at here is a release cycle, and a lot of companies focus in on just getting the product delivered. But what we really want to talk about is the entire development, delivery, and feedback process. Testing, slowing us down, that's typically the #1 time sink in the delivery process, but we will also talk a lot about getting yourselves organized and finding the right tools as part of this presentation. But I really wanted to focus on the fact that not a lot of people pay attention to that feedback loop. It's all about rapid development, rapid delivery, and continuous delivery in our our practices today. But that feedback loop shouldn't be ignored either. And so I think it's that feedback loop that I want to focus on for the beginning part of the presentation, and then we'll get into talking about getting organized and getting to the right tools. So first of all, when I was director of a very large testing organization in one of my last jobs, I was presenting all of my test metrics. It was part of our regression test process. We had, as you can see, a large number of applications that we were, kind of looking at in terms of our total release delivery. And of course, I've shamelessly copied that here and didn't change any of the names to protect the guilty. Sorry about that. But I had a question directed at me by our customer support manager and said, well, how do I know that this product is of high quality? And, I kept saying, well, look at my test results, look at the metrics. I mean, all of these percent passed, everything that I planned, I've executed, everything is going very well here. I've got, just a couple of areas that I've highlighted that I'm concerned about, but I really couldn't answer her question. So what I really set out to look at was how can I make my test metrics really represent overall product quality, and how do I really kind of focus those in on business goals? So I sat down with my team and we started looking at what we should test. Those test cases, if I'm going to keep presenting those metrics, which by the way were mandated by an organization that I didn't really have any control over, if I was going to make those test metrics more useful, maybe I should start looking at what it is that I test. So we started to answer the question, what about the applications, or applications, in my case, many applications under test, would cause the company to lose money, lose business? They're not necessarily the same thing. What environment do I need to be running my tests in? How do I emulate what the customers are doing and using my product? What types of issues are escaping the testing process? What is customer support constantly answering? What are they writing knowledge bases, articles on? And what are the high-risk end-to-end business processes that we're dealing with, those processes that our business runs every day. And what we did is we came up with a set of meaningful use tests, and that's what we called them. We were actually regulated by the government, and so meaningful use was not a foreign term. It wasn't something that we made up. But I think that it reflects those questions above in terms of, you know, what are those things that really have an impact on your business, will have an impact to your customer, and will have an impact on the overall quality of your product. So really taking a look at those meaningful use tests, that became kind of our quality goals. So with those quality goals in mind, the next step was to assess what we had. So what do our current tests do? And in that case, we found most of our tests did not actually reflect a good, meaningful use of our applications and of our products. They weren't written in such a way that, in fact, some of them didn't even make sense. Some of them obviously didn't cover what they were supposed to cover, and some of them were actually even written for an older version of our product. The product is more stable now, and so some of those tests really didn't have a whole lot of usefulness being run, in their current state. So they needed to be revamped. We took a look at the test tools that we were using. The automated test that we were using, we actually weren't using it very consistently for all of the applications that made up our portfolio. Looking at the testing resources and staffing, who do our testers need to interact with, and did they have easy access to those people? Could we hire more resources, and if so, what skills and experiences could we hire? And then we looked at what kind of feedback we were getting. Again, back to that feedback loop, we had spent so much time working on just getting our products delivered and out the door. We weren't taking a look at, how do we know that this is what customers really want? How do we know that we're addressing the issues that they have? How do we know that they have a vehicle or an avenue to request enhancements or new functionality? And what kinds of services are our customers asking for help? Is it with maybe installing the product or using the product, training on the product, or getting started? So really taking a look at what we had gave us a lot of insight and allowed us to be able to narrow the focus of our testing. So looking at that quality goal, remember that quality goal kind of being a set of meaningful use tests that were going to give us a good idea of overall product quality. Now what should the scope and approach for our testing be? So we rewrote our test plans at that point. And I've seen a lot of organizations really kind of focus in on this and have an aha moment when they start looking at that end-to-end meaningful use type tests. It does cause a lot of rethinking of the current plan and maybe jettisoning some of their old test cases. What needs to be automated versus run manually? This is a question that I get a lot from our current customers, as well as from organizations that I worked for. And I've kind of come up with a rule of thumb over the years, and that is any test that you're going to run more than 4 times. 4 is kind of an arbitrary number, but any test that you're going to want to run and rerun 4 times or more should be automated. That doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to use it for the rest of perpetuity on that product, but if you've taken the time to run it manually 4 different times, you've discovered everything that you were going to discover through kind of that ad hoc exploratory process, and the cost of continuing to rerun that manually, it really starts to add up as you get into a large number of test cases, as you saw with the organization the metrics that I produced or presented to you just a few minutes ago. It's just served me well as a good rule of thumb. Your rule of thumb may differ, but I think you get the general idea. That the more you run those tests manually, the more money that they'll cost you. Looking at setting up the test environment, we really struggle with test data. We've got a lot of customers that struggle with test data. How to manage it, where to store it, all of those things really come into play, but generating the test data as well. Taking a look at the test environment and getting the data populated in the environment, entering data. I've got customers who are talking about actually using an automated test tool, Turnkey's automated test tool, to populate their test data. Take a look at the roles, responsibilities, and credentials. How are you accessing your application? Do I have all of those user IDs set up and the logins? That's a lot of the kind of the setup that has to go into your test automation and your manual testing as well. Where do I store all that information so the testers have access to it and can look it up? And am I adding and updating and refreshing those roles often enough to kind of emulate a real-life type use or a meaningful use? And what about documentation? How well are my tests documented? Where do I keep that documentation? Where do I organize my tests? And then start taking a look at the application. And what we did was we segmented the application into components. And so those user interface screens became components. And those components then were a piece that could be reused every time we access that screen. And BPT supports this really well, but changes happen very rapidly, especially in a rapid development or an agile environment. So there are ways to kind of take care of that as well. So let's talk a little bit about organizing for success. Everybody asks me, how do we organize ourselves, especially if we're going to start a test automation endeavor. This is how we organized ourselves. I'll talk a little bit more about this, but basically every application had a team that worked together, the testers and the business analysts, in conjunction with a developer. A developer had access to our team as well. And we had test automation engineers as well as test leads and test architects. And I'll go into a little bit about that role. But again, every application had kind of a similar structure. And in this case, this became kind of our Scrum team. If you're familiar with an Agile methodology practice, this was our Scrum team for this particular application. So let's go through kind of a day in the life. I know this is a very busy slide. I apologize. But there's a lot going on during test planning, test design, and test execution. I didn't really show the development here. I think that you guys kind of have that covered pretty well. But there are roles for each of these people in your test planning, test design, and test execution. You've got the analysts documenting requirements, but they also should be participating in your test design review. Your test leads should really be breaking things up into, what are components? Let's take a look at this screen. Maybe on this particular screen, we want to break it up into a header and a footer. And then having the test automation engineers develop those automated tests for us. The business analyst should be working on data entry. They know the product from a customer's perspective better than most. But the test lead should also be engaged in that, because getting that data organized in the testing framework is also very important. So it's really a joint effort between the business analyst and the test lead. Test automation engineers then are creating those components, supporting the data sheet entry. Data sheets are not necessarily unique to turnkey C-Factory solution. They're usable in ALM as well, using UFT, Unified Functional Test. But everybody working together on the test structure and reviewing the tests is very key and critical. Having a test architecture also support your ALM environment or your testing framework is extremely important as well. Making sure that standards are followed, making sure that everything is up to date in the environment, and providing some direction, with your test tool updates, new functionality that might come along. They play a very important role as well. And then when it comes to test execution, having your business analyst really, who's really responsible, I think, for the quality of the product, review the test results. While your testers are more focused on executing, managing the test execution, opening defects, making sure that defects are closed, maintaining the tests as the application changes, the business analyst really needs to take a broader approach or a broader view at the testing activities to make sure that those test results are what we need them to be. And again, if we focus our test cases on more of a meaningful use, that business analyst has a more active role in this whole process, because we may be coordinating with other test teams or Scrum teams. As you can see, kind of organization-wide, when we're looking at a meaningful use test, that may bridge multiple different Scrum teams. And I've shown each of those teams as a Scrum team here, since that's the way that we did use that in past places that I've worked. But you've got multiple applications, multiple Scrum teams, and those Scrum teams are all working together on those meaningful use test cases. So what we've done in places past, or we had something called a meta Scrum or a super Scrum. You can call it whatever you want. But that group would meet together to make sure that all the Scrum teams were on track. We used an agile management tool. We used Rally at many places that I worked, and every Scrum team had access and visibility into the progress of the Scrum teams that were working on the other applications, because of the fact that we all shared some piece of that meaningful use end-to-end business flow. So having kind of a meta Scrum, a super Scrum, the Scrum of Scrums, we've called it a lot of different things over different places that I've worked, but having that governing body kind of make sure that all the Scrum teams have the right communication flow between one another was very important. Anything that was stuck, any scope creep, it needed to be discussed from that body, and really the outcome were those meaningful use test cases. So everybody was very focused in on what their role was in a meaningful use test case, and what component of that they owned. Not to be confused with a component which may represent a screen in your application, but that component of that end-to-end meaningful use business flow. So as you're developing your test cases, what you're really doing is you're adding to your regression suite. What do you do with all these automated tests? As you go through multiple releases, you're building upon what you've already run, you've already executed there. We use the nomenclature right in ALM. You can create new fields. We use the nomenclature high priority, middle priority, and low priority to talk about those tests that kind of needed to be run all of the time, some of the time, and infrequently. You can just call them A, B, and C, but the idea is that you're continuously running these test cases. Like I said, any test case that you're going to run more than 4 times, you want to automate, but what you're really doing is you're building up some regression pools here. And the end result was we had taken a 4 to 6 week regression test, and through our automation, starting very early in the process, which we'll get to very next, we were able to kind of take that down to just a few days. So we had some really significant success with our test automation. Obviously, there were a lot of challenges with it, and we'll start talking about some of those challenges. So let's talk about scriptless automation, because that really kind of played into some of the challenges that we had. As we were developing these meaningful use tests, we were hard-pressed to find the folks that knew the application from the user's perspective. And those people were really our business analysts. And kind of getting those into our Scrum team was really, I think, the secret to our success. They were no longer just writing requirements for us and passing those requirements down to us from on high. They were reviewing the test cases. They were looking at the user interface that the developers demoed to them. Is this what you had in mind? Is this what's going to impact the customer in a meaningful way? So getting those people involved in that testing, in the test development, is super important. And if your test cases are all scripted, these are the people who will least understand the scripting languages, your business analysts. So having some testing tool that gives them the power to see what those tests do, know how those tests work, and know that those tests are doing exactly what you think you're doing so that they reflect an end-to-end meaningful use business flow, are your best bet there. Scriptless automation can definitely help you with that. Having you be able to break up your application into components or screens that you can assemble into tests and reuse. I can't stress enough how important reuse is in a test automation environment. Having a tool that very quickly also updates and keeps those things maintained as things change with that component. You can then focus your changes on the component that changed, and you don't necessarily need to re-script the entire test. It allows you also to run end-to-end tests within a single component, or it spans multiple applications. Most of your meaningful use business flows are going to cross multiple applications. Again, that's where you want to make sure that you've got your Scrum teams or your application teams talking closely together. And a scriptless automation tool can help you keep your data organized and keep it attached where the data is being used. It also maximizes your testing time. So if you're not scripting, the application is changing, you're not re-scripting, you're making easy updates to your automated test cases, and that means getting yourself to a faster release. So all of those things, I think, can be achieved through a scriptless automation tool. I try not to make this very salesy, but that's why I wanted to come to Turnkey, because I saw C-Factory, I saw how it worked, and I knew that it could solve a lot of the problems that we had run into in places that I had worked previously. So let's go through the kind of the continuous test delivery. What does this all mean in an agile environment? When I'm developing my user interface and I'm developing all of the components behind that user interface, how do my tests kind of come together here? So if I'm looking in Sprint 1, maybe not necessarily Sprint 1, you want to start when your application is a little bit more mature than maybe sprint 1. But maybe you're going through and you're making some updates to it, and it's sprint 1 of your update cycle. This is when you're starting to put together your test plans. You're starting to build your components. So I'm taking a look at this screen and I'm making a component out of the screen. And my business analysts are putting together the requirements, making sure that the screen looks the way that we want it to look. And then the development cycle kind of proceeds, and I'm adding more screens. Maybe I've added 2 screens in my sprint 2. And so I'm now starting to build those components as we're developing additional screens, and everybody is working together in conjunction with one another. At some point, we've got enough of these user interface screens connected together, or regions of the screens, and we're starting to put some data together. And you can see my data sheet here. We're starting to enter the data into those screens and the fields on the screens accordingly. Maybe I've had some changes to some of those screens. Maybe one of the screens that I developed in Sprint 2 or Sprint 1 has changed. I want my test tool to be easily able to, to kind of adjust to that. That test tool should be able to manage that as well. And the easier it manages it, the better for you. This test tool will also hopefully manage the data as well. If I add a component or I remove a component or I change a component, the data or the data sheet should reflect that change as well. And then I get all the way to to where I'm executing those test cases, debugging those tests, and I'm fixing the product bugs. And there I'm really exercising and executing those test cases in earnest. Executing the test cases kind of all along continuously is a goal. We have a lot of our customers currently, as they're building their test cases, they're executing. So I don't mean to exclude the fact that you can't, or preclude the fact that you can't start execution earlier. But at some point you're going to get to the point where you can, or you have enough of the application strung together where you can do your execution. So kind of, again, the maintenance of your tests, making sure that you're not having to re-script or recode while you're debugging your test cases. ApplicationAware test tools make this a lot easier because you've got your components that you're updating. You're not updating your entire test script. You're using a test tool like cFactory where you've got some kind of side-by-side comparison of new or deleted changes, and you've also got an immediate identification of changes in your data sheet. So again, building that meaningful use end-to-end test may start with one application and then span another application, and those individual scenarios. I click here, enter this, go to this screen, enter a bunch more data, and then go to a final screen, maybe where I'm reviewing some data, I'm summarizing some data. Those should all be reflected in your data sheet, and those data sheets should be attached to your test cases. So now, if you're using this kind of meaningful use approach, when you're automating those tests and you're reporting on your test results, I've got so many tests planned, I've executed this many has passed. Now you've got the confidence in the product quality. You've also got the buy-in of the entire organization because you've organized yourself such that your business analysts, your developers, your testers are all on the same page. Everybody's pulling together. Everybody's working on the same pieces of tests that build up to this meaningful use end-to-end business flow. And your regression test sets are building over each release. Now you can start to show a real quality, your metrics now start to reflect real quality in the testing that you're doing. You can also start to measure the amount of time that you're saving by not manually running these test cases. Like I said, we've taken 4 to 6 weeks down to just a few days. You can also measure the efficiency of the Scrum teams by the velocity. And so that can also reflect on how easy it is to create these test cases and how quickly they assemble, how quickly they maintain themselves as you're making changes, as you're going through your development cycle. You obviously, of course, you also want to look at your defect backlog, and you want to make sure that you're continuously pumping that into your test cases. We had an escape analysis process where all of the customer support reported issues were analyzed, and they were then kind of triaged for inclusion into our test bed. Not only were the developers taking a look at them, but the entire Scrum team was taking a look at them. Sometimes they resulted in new requirements. They always resulted in new test cases, whether they impacted the development or not. So those are things that you also want to be taking a look at. Again, those test cases that your customers that are the result of your customers reporting an issue, those should always be high priority test cases. And in my mind, those were things that were always automated. If they were able to be automated, of course, not everything is automatable. But taking a look at that defect backlog and automating those tests and adding them to our regression cycle was something that was very valuable for us. So looking at the overall continuous delivery process, you're kind of breaking things up into your system testing, your requirements development, your application development, and with those are associated kind of sub-processes. System testing, you want to be looking at automated testing and automated test tools. Requirements development, you want to be looking at requirements tracking and requirements tracking tools. Application development, you obviously have your automated build tools and your automated release tools. So you've got a number of tools that are supporting this continuous delivery process. So let's maybe start taking a look at that mix of tools that you're going to want to take a look at there. So your Agile story tracking, like I said, I have used Rally software at a lot of different companies. I'm not a spokesperson for Rally, but I found that works very, very well. We also used ALM. Most every place that I've ever worked has used ALM. But again, you want to really look at, are you just using ALM to store your tests, or are you using the full benefit of ALM? It does have some very powerful elements to it. The least of not which is the fact that cFactory works on top of it. A version control system, super important to use a good version control system. I've used a number of good and bad systems over the years. Actually, I can't think of off the top of my head what a bad system was. The fact that we used a version control system, I think, was kind of key and critical there. Automated build, you definitely want to make sure that those builds at the end of your iteration, that you've got a build that you have your Scrum team has generated for that product. We had a number of applications that were working kind of in tandem with one another. So that automated build not only had to put out a build of the application that we were working on, but it also had to kind of congeal all of the different applications into our portfolio solution. Defect tracking system can be done in ALM. A lot of companies that I've worked, we chose to have separate defect tracking systems. There are great free ones on the market. Bugzilla comes to mind. A test management tool, something like ALM, test automation tool. Of course, I'm going to recommend cFactory. And a data management tool. Again, I'm going to recommend cFactory in conjunction with ALM. there. But you know, really looking at the mix of tools that you need should be part of your planning process that we spoke about earlier in the presentation. And I can't stress enough using customer feedback in your software lifecycle, your software design lifecycle. Sorry about that. It's a little bit of transposed letters there. Measuring those escapes, using user forums, having the users, you know, tell you how they use the product. Shouldn't be an activity that just your business analysts attend. It should be something that all of the members of your Scrum team are involved with. I've had developers cycle through customer support organizations that I've run before, so that they can see firsthand the kinds of questions that are coming in. If they can't cycle through the customer support organization, that they should at the very least be looking at the issues that customer support you know, kind of maintains, Pareto charts, or you know, some kind of categorizing of what types of issues are coming in. That information should be very readily available to all of the Scrum teams. And customer advisory boards are very important, especially when you're looking at changing the feature set of your application quite a bit. And all of these should be fodder for new test cases and new tests that are developed, and fodder for the development of meaningful use business flows that represent end-to-end test cases through your application. So I think I'm doing a lot of talking here. I'd like to open it up for questions and see if there are some questions that you guys have over anything that I presented here. Robert, do we have any questions?
Yeah, hi Becky. Thanks for that great presentation. Obviously, a lot of very applicable, meaningful information for today's software development projects, using a different variety of methodologies and different tools. But we have had quite a few questions coming in during the presentation, and I will start to go through those. We have obviously about 15-20 minutes where we can get through, I think, most of these questions. The first question that I see is, does this approach that you've been speaking about work for applications that are changing constantly while being developed, or do I have to wait until the application is stable?
Yeah, that's an excellent, excellent question, and I think that I talked just a little bit about that. Certainly, it's better to really start automating your tests as the application gets a little bit more mature, but it doesn't preclude you from starting to capture those components, or start to at least identify what components you want to develop your test cases around. So they can be either roughed in, or they can be captured and can be updated as you go along. A tool like cFactory does allow you to update that component fairly painlessly without scripting, and it also helps to manage your data for you as well. So you really can't start that too early. Although most will say that, you know, waiting till the application is a little bit mature might be a little bit more helpful.
Thank you, Becky. Thank you for that answer. The next question is more in relationship with the data. So they're asking if you could explain, where should we store our test data and how? Yeah,
so right with the test case. You can attach your Excel spreadsheet directly to ALM. cFactory comes with a data driver that helps you manage your test data, and your data represents each of your component fields. So your component, remember, is maybe one of your application screens or a region on the screen, and your data, according to what you're going to enter in each of those fields, is saved with that test case in your test plan, or it's saved with the test set for your entire end-to-end flow. So you should keep your test data right with your test cases.
Good. Thank you very much, Becky. I also believe that the test data is an integral part of the whole test automation process. Our next question comes from Carmen, and Carmen's asking, who decides what is meaningful to be tested? Is that, you know, the business, the product owner, the analyst, or the tester? Who decides what is meaningful to be tested?
And that's a great question, Carmen. Thanks for answering that. In places that I've worked previously, it has been the business analyst. And I want to qualify that with saying that the business analyst was in part an owner of that particular piece of the product. The analysts for each of the product also got together. They kind of had their own Meta Scrum, Super Scrum, and got together and really talked about those end-to-end meaningful use business cases. But those were things that were really identified during a planning session that we would have at the beginning of every one of our major releases. So the analysts drove that planning session. We would write these end-to-end business stories down on basically large flip charts on the wall, and the business analysts would start to get together and talk about them, and talk about, you know, what meant or what constituted meaningful use, using some of those questions that I used at the beginning of the presentation. Once those were decided upon from the business analysts, who really in that sense were our product owners, then they were disseminated down to the Scrum teams, because the business analysts were members of the Scrum team. Each Scrum team had you know, definitely committed to memory each of those meaningful use test cases and knew what their part was, and all of the user stories for that particular Scrum team were derived from those meaningful use test cases.
Hopefully that answered. That question and its answer, I think, give us a segue into the next question that a user asked. How often should we execute automated tests?
Execute early and execute often. Yeah, no, that's a great question. You know, as we would develop our applications, we would execute the test cases as soon as the test cases could be executed. And of course, that's gonna be different for every test case. So it's going to be on a case-to-case basis. You certainly want to execute at the end of every one of your iterations, and you certainly want to execute some number of your tests before you release that product. When you release that product, I think, you know, kind of has a lot to do with the metrics that you put in place and some of the quality controls that your organization is going to have. But I think that it's also helpful to execute those test cases when you have other changes in your environment. You know, we made a change to our test environment. We made a change to one of the applications through which all of our meaningful use test cases went. So a lot of those changes triggered kind of the re-execution of a full-blown regression script. So I think, you know, that you're going to need to make that determination according to you know, what the types of changes are. But I think kind of on a regular day-to-day basis, you're going to be executing those as soon as they're executable.
Oh, great. Thank you, Becky, for that answer. And Mark has a similar type question in the sense that he wants to ask, do you try to automate new functionality introduced in a sprint to be used during that sprint, or do you try and stay one sprint behind? So as you're going through and you're your agile process and you're adding more and more functionality via the sprints, are you adding that functionality introduced in that sprint and testing it there, or do you work on those and try to play catch up, I guess is the question from Mark.
Yeah, no, that's a good question, and we definitely we struggled with that too in a couple of different places that I've worked. It depends on how you define done. With kind of the agile methodology, there's a saying, done is done, and your Scrum team decides what done is done is, and we decided that it wasn't done until all of the test cases for that functionality that was added were executed and we met some kind of exit criteria for that iteration. Some iterations or some Scrum Agile practices are a little bit more hardcore than that, and the iteration, it basically says, all right, thou shalt have 3 weeks and only 3 weeks, and whatever you don't get done in that 3 weeks time spills into the next iteration. So that would obviously, kind of send you in the other area that, you might want to then lag your test automation until the next iteration. You may run out of time otherwise.
Very good. Thank you again for that answer. Our next question comes from Vinay, and he's asking, based on your experiences, what percentage of automated scripts or automation scripts usually require maintenance over a period of time?
Most of them. I'd be hard pressed to put it in a percentage, but in a healthy, it depends on the application, but in a healthy, growing application, it's going to be a fairly high percentage, which is why you really want to choose a tool that lends itself well to dealing with those changes. And that right there was the kind of the trigger that got me interested in CFactory. I mean, it's got to be over 70% of your test cases are going to be changing. Again, I would also caution you to take a look at your test cases continuously. That planning that I talked about in the beginning of the presentation, that should happen quite regularly. A lot of your tests will become obsolete and either need to be refreshed or just plain thrown away, regardless of the effort that you put into automating them. They do outlive their usefulness. Tests will change, and and I think that it's important to allow some time, plan a sprint, or use your hackathon to look at updating your test automation.
All right, that was a good answer. Another question here from Mark is CFactory used instead of UFT or alongside it?
CFactory works with UFT, so it sort of works on top of it. It uses a lot of the same constructs as UFT, the object repository, but it parameterizes and assigns keywords to each of the fields that you see, and that's what takes away the programming or the scripting in UFT. So it's not necessarily an instead of, but it works on top of.
Great. Thank you for that response. Another question about CFactory comes from Tracy, and she'd like to know what version and or components of HP Quality Center /ALM are needed to work with CFactory.
We at Turnkey, we try to stay abreast of the latest releases that are coming out of HP. So generally, we say the latest and greatest. If a new release comes out, we generally are about 1 to 2 months behind a brand new release. What we're doing is we're waiting to see if there are any patches or bug fixes before we we'll do a full set of testing on a latest ALM and UFT release. But in general, the latest releases are always supported.
We have a question here, Becky, from Marvin. Is BBT testing better for Oracle or web, or equally effective?
It's equally effective. BPT and componentization, you know, really, it really has the benefit of setting up those reusable components for testing, and allows maintenance to focus in on, you know, as those components change, you're updating the component as opposed to the entire test. So I would say that it's useful for Oracle, SAP, all of your ERP applications, Salesforce, PeopleSoft, as well as web-based applications. Turnkey currently has customers that use cFactory, which also uses BPT with UFT, on all types of different applications, web-based as well.
Thank you very much. That's been my experiences also, but I was happy to hear your take on the situation. Another question comes from Pam, and Pam asks, what is the recommended tool for build automation that can be used for continuous integration with Turnkey?
I don't really have a good answer to that one. A build tool, you know, there's not a lot of tight integration right now with cFactory and a build tool. So I'm gonna kind of skip over that question for now. I don't really have a favorite. I don't have a great recommendation there.
That's okay. We'll move on to the next question, which comes from Santi. Can all regression test cases be automated, and are there any limitations with automation? Let's see that answer for that one, Becky.
Oh, heck yeah. No, not all regression tests can be automated. You know, again, back to that rule of thumb. If you're not gonna run it and rerun it more than 4 times, some tests just plain, you know, don't lend themselves well to automation. You know, you've got maybe you know, conditional data, changing data. You know, if this happens, then that. Maybe you're just, you know, doing a smoke test and you're just looking to see if something pops up on the screen. You know, it's not something that you should strive to automate 100% of your test cases. It's just not doable. It's not feasible, and you're probably going to waste a lot of time going through some extraordinary methods to make it happen. We used to kind of joke with one another, you know, if it required a Huey helicopter and you know, and something that was unobtainable in order to automate it, you know, leave it alone. So I don't really have a good Huey helicopter example for you, but certainly not everything is going to be automatable.
That is a very valid answer, and appreciate your insight into that. Our next question comes from Chris, and Chris would like to know, how do you keep track of what test case is fulfilled by which type of automation? Is there a way to keep track of that?
What test case is fulfilled by which type of automation? I'm not exactly sure I understand the question.
So I guess the question, if I could elaborate, would be: is there a way to differentiate between what has been automated with, let's say, UFT or cFactory, or whether it's kept manual? So is there a way to keep track of that at the test case level?
Okay. Yeah. So we have a lot of customers that are currently doing this, and UFT automated tests can coexist very nicely with cFactory automated tests, and we have customers that even store their manual tests in ALM as well. Deciding upon your folder structure, I think is kind of key and critical there. How we're going to we're going to segregate or subdivide our tests. Do we put all of our applications in the same project? Do we split projects by application? These are all things that that we actually are asked by our customers to kind of jump in and provide our consulting services for. So yeah, we have a lot of customers who do it a lot of different ways. I think it's going to be what works best for you, but certainly managing all of that in ALM is very doable and very easy. It's just a matter of setting up a folder structure that works for you.
Thank you, Becky. Appreciate that answer. We are at the top of the hour. I wanted to just say, for those of you that are still on the call with us, that the presentation will be posted to the Vivid website, and some of the questions that we don't get to, if we don't get to all of them live today while we're still doing the webinar, those will be posted to the Vivid website also. I think we can probably get a few more questions in real quick before the end of the webinar, and I just wanted to make sure that the people that were still with us knew that they can go to the website, the Vivid website afterwards, and get the copy of the presentation and the questions and answers. So we have about 3 or 4 more questions if we have time for them still. The first one that I think is next would be from Marvin, and he's asking, how is C-Factory better than out-of-the-box HP BPT?
How is it better?
Or what differentiates it? What differentiates it from HP BPT?
Well, good, because I'm obviously biased. I I work for Turnkey. Differentiating it really is how the components are created. It's an application-aware product. C-Factory is, and you create components by basically clicking on an application screen, and C-Factory will automatically learn that application for you. You can then adjust the parameters. The parameters become things that are displayed in your data sheet, and you're filling in data for your data sheet. When you're working with BPT, you're developing those components scripting. And so that's really the main difference, is that C-Factory is a scriptless component generator, and it also has an element of data sheet management involved in it, whereas in BPT you're very manually updating your data sheet. So I think that those are the key differences there.
Well, thank you. I think we have time for 2 more questions if we're not losing people as they have to move on to other daily events. The next question is, who should do the test automation implementation? And if it's spread out across the organization, how do you keep the implementation streamlined?
So who should do it? I think I showed those Scrum teams where I had a test automation engineer doing the bulk of the automation. How do you keep them streamlined? And that's really through that Scrum of Scrums, or Meta Scrum, or whatever you want to call it, Super Scrum. Obviously, we also set some standards for test automation, and keeping that streamlined and keeping those standards in check was the role of the test architect. So making sure that we had test architecture representation on all the Scrum teams kind of helped keep all of that in check as well. But keeping it streamlined in terms of keeping it on task to the meaningful use, that was the business analyst's role. The test lead's role as well, working with the data analyst, had some responsibility in that, and then the test architect to keep it standardized. So there's a lot of checks and balances in that organization layout that I presented earlier.
Thank you, Becky. We still have quite a few of the attendees with us listening to the questions and the answers that you're providing. So I'd like to jump into two more questions. The first one from Marvin. Do you suggest management in test development such as HP Quality Center built-in version control?
Could you ask the question again, Robert? I'm not sure that I got it.
Sure. The question deals with change management as you're going through the test development. And would you recommend, what do you suggest? Would you recommend the HP Quality Center version control that's built in?
Oh, absolutely. I would recommend it, and it works well with cFactory. We were a highly regulated environment in some of the places that I've worked, and I mean, version control was not optional. So you definitely have to be able to justify this, or not justify, but draw on this was the set of tests that were associated with this particular release. And I can recreate not only that release, but I can also recreate the test cases that went along with that release. And that was something that, that was part of the regulated environment in which we worked. So yes, absolutely, I would recommend that you use version control. Only if you need it. Obviously, don't go through that extra step if it's something that you don't need.
Great. Two more questions, I believe. The first one comes from Brian, and it's a more involved answer, I believe, but can you provide for us a more detailed definition of scriptless automation and how it's different from scripted?
Sure. Scriptless automation is keyword-driven automation where a keyword represents each of the objects on the screen. Where you're scripting, you're having to draw upon the object recognition from the repository and assign, you're basically, you're scripting. You are coding how those objects are manipulated. When you are using cFactory, for example, which is a scriptless automation tool, you've got a representation of that object, the parameters for that object, and then that representation is transferred to your data sheet where you can fill in the data for that object automatically as opposed to having to program that in.
Thank you for that excellent explanation. Appreciate it very much. I think the final question we're going to have time for today comes from Aditya, and the question is, does cFactory work with applications built on all platforms? For example, Flex, mainframe, .NET,
yes,
et cetera, et cetera.
Yes. Yes, cFactory does. Anywhere that there's object recognition in UFT, we work with that application. In some cases, our professional services team at Turnkey can use UFT's extensibility accelerator to extend UFT's object recognition, and we have done that as a service to some of our customers to work with some more of their legacy applications. But for the most part, anywhere UFT works, cFactory will work.
Thank you so very much. I do think we're going to wrap up with this final question. I think this is a very important and applicable question, not only to the presentation today, but to the whole IT world that we are all dealing with. And the question is lengthy, so let me just read it and then get your response. In regards to your day in the life slide, getting this level of buy-in is absolutely the best practice, and in most organizations is also expensive and not funded. Do you have any suggestions on how to deal with the organization that is not committed to testing in the way that you described?
Yeah, and I've dealt with that. you know, for us, it kind of came through that customer support manager asking, you know, how do I know that your application is of high quality or the product is of high quality? But I think that, you know, most executives get the whole meaningful use approach. They get the bottom line to the business. They get the impact to the customer, and they get the fact that, you know, the business can possibly lose money if you don't test the right things. And so taking a look at it from that perspective really helps kind of escalate or elevate the importance of this type of testing and the structure that I proposed. We found that it was actually fairly easy to get buy-in when we started talking about meaningful use tests. Well, not only was it kind of mandated by some of the regulatory restrictions that we had, but it was also something that the executives understood a little bit better because it dealt with the bottom line. So I think once you start putting meaningful use test cases together and you start having the organization kind of linked together in the pursuit of making those end-to-end meaningful use business case scenarios a reality, that the executive level will definitely pay attention, because you know that's what's going to make or break the business, I think, ultimately.
Correct, and I would add to your response one of your slides where you had earlier in the presentation today, where you had those bullets that said, you know, why is this meaningful to the business? How is this going to cost the business customers or money? And those are all meaningful bullets to address with the organization, such that they will buy into a more meaningful and comprehensive quality assurance program as you've presented here today. So I think with that, we're about 13 minutes after the hour. I think it's a very good time to wrap up here. We here from Vivid thank you all for attending today, those of you that are still with us on the webinar. Again, please remember that this presentation and the materials or the questions and answers will be posted on the Vivid website in the coming days. So you can go to the Vivid website and download this presentation, review it again, share it with your teams if you'd like, and look at the questions and answers in detail. After this webinar is complete, we'd like to ask you to complete a short survey, and if you'd like, you can opt in for more information from Turnkey Solutions. You can see here on this slide the Turnkey Solutions URL, so you can go to their website and explore all the solutions and services that Turnkey Solutions provides to these HP customers, and of course the Vivid website URL is here. Again, for the entire Vivid organization and for Becky and Turnkey Solutions, I'd like to thank all of you for attending today, and we appreciate your time and look forward to speaking with you and working with you in the future. With that, I'll turn it back over to Vivid.
Yes, thank you everyone for joining. You will receive follow-up emails. We appreciate your time. Bye-bye.